All right. The very last thing I want to talk to you guys about today is when we're looking at the data, there are some things that they might talk about when they're talking about the spread, where they might also talk about an outlier. Okay, so when we are talking about the spread, what they're trying to say is when I look at the data, kind of what does it look like overall? The thing that's easiest for me is if I take a look, if I try to draw a line over top of my data, right? So for example, if I go, okay, is it mostly even? Does it look like it's really clearly drops off way over to one side, or is it most pretty evenly spread out? This one, for the most part, is pretty evenly spread out. So when they ask you about the spread, right, this one would be an example of symmetrical, right? And I know that that's another math word. You've talked about symmetry before in definitely 5th grade and probably even earlier than that. Symmetry meaning that it's kind of mostly the same on every side, right? It's mostly symmetrical. You're going to see that with any type of curve that looks something like that, right? It might go way up and down. That's fine too. But as long as it's pretty much looks the same on both sides-ish, right? It's not going to be perfect. Then it would be symmetrical. You might also see a spread like this one. If I were to draw a curve over top of this, notice, that wasn't very pretty, but notice that it looks like the hump, right? Most of my data is way over here on the left. This would be an example of it being what we call skewed, where most of the data is on the left. So you might say it's skewed left. If most of my data was on the right, then you would say skewed to the right. Now, your data is pretty much going to be skewed anytime that you have what we call an outlier, okay? An outlier would be like 1 or 2 pieces of data that just seem way far away from everything else, right? So for example, when I'm taking a look at this one, right, I have a couple of outliers. This one is 23 and 24. Those are way far away from most of the data. Most of this data is right over in here, except for those 2 that are farther away. So those are the outliers. Sometimes you'll have 1, sometimes maybe you'll have 2, but it's really never going to be much more than that. Okay, those are the outliers. Now the issue is when we have an outlier, if I'm trying to find the middle, those outliers can make my middle look a little bit off from where most of the data is. Anytime that we have an outlier, when you're asked to find the measure of center, you're going to want to use the median, because the median for this type of data is going to be more accurate of just kind of getting rid of those outliers. It's going to give you a better idea of where the middle of your data is than the mean. Because when with the mean, remember, we had to add them all up and then divide by how many pieces of data we have. Now, the issue with that is when I add them up, it's going to make my sum be a lot bigger. And then when I divide, it takes those into the average. So you really only want to use the mean when you have some more symmetrical data. When you have the symmetrical data, the mean is really going to be more accurate than the median. But when we have any type of skewed data left or right, you're going to want to use that median because it's going to just kind of get rid of those bigger numbers better than if you were to use the mean. So that's a quick overview on spread and outliers. There are some questions a lot like this on 333, and they talk about it a little bit on 329 of your packet. So make sure you keep in mind looking for those outliers. So for example, if I'm taking a look at a list of data instead of a dot plot, notice that it goes 13, 14, right? And they're all pretty close to each other, 22, 24, 25. And then we have this 46. That is way further away from most of the data. So in this case, my 46 is my outlier, right? So I want you to ask yourself, which measure of center, mean or median, which one would I want to use if I have an outlier? So I want you to pause and think about that. Okay, hopefully you remembered from before, if we have an outlier, if it's going to be skewed left or right one way, we want to be using the median, right? The median is going to give us a better measure of center than the mean will in this case. So our range is also going to be affected by an outlier because my range, remember my range is the difference. So that would be 46, my biggest number, minus 13, my smallest number. Okay, and if I subtract those, this would be 33. So that's the range is saying, well, most of my data, or all my data, is between 33 text messages from the smallest to the biggest. But that's not really where most of the data is. Really, most of it is between 25 and 13. It's just that one, 46, that's way further away. So the range, when you have an outlier, can be kind of misleading. We're not going to change the range, but just know that the range is going to be affected by that outlier as well. So if you have any questions on that, first, I would suggest check out Khan Academy. They've got a lot more videos, or you feel free to text me and reach out. Good job, you guys. Keep it up.